Sometimes, the secrets we keep closest are the ones that destroy us the fastest. In 2018, a quiet suburban neighborhood was shaken by the sudden disappearance of a devoted wife, a woman who was loved, trusted, and seemingly had it all. But when her phone stopped ringing and her husband couldn't reach her, what began as a missing person case soon unraveled into a web of betrayal, obsession, and hidden messages no one was meant to read. Before we begin, if you love mysterious, true life stories that prove truth is always stranger than fiction, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chilling story. This is the case of a forbidden affair, a jealous young girlfriend, and the haunting truth revealed through a string of desperate text messages. Now let's begin. Ellen Parker had always been the kind of woman everyone admired from a distance. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had her life figured out, the devoted wife, the caring mother, the dependable neighbor. To anyone looking in, her world looked neat, balanced, almost enviable. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in Oregon, where every house looked nearly identical and every family seemed to follow the same rhythm. Morning school runs, weekend barbecues, and polite smiles exchanged at the mailbox. Ellen's life had a calm predictability to it, and for years she believed that was enough. Her husband Daniel was successful, often traveling for work and providing everything they could ever need. Their 2 teenage children were growing more independent by the day, their attention shifting from family dinners to friends, sports, and late-night calls. Ellen would find herself sitting in the living room at night, a glass of wine half finished beside her, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and wondering when her home had started feeling so silent. Then came Jake Mendez, the neighbor's son. He was 22, just back from college, and helping his mother settle into her new life after remarrying. Jake was polite, full of energy, and had that easy charm only youth could bring. He greeted everyone with a grin, offered to help carry groceries, and waved at Ellen each morning as she backed her SUV out of the driveway. At first it was nothing, a friendly smile, small talk over hedges, a wave here and there. But loneliness is patient. It waits for the smallest crack to slip through. For Ellen, Jake became that unexpected distraction, a reminder that someone still saw her, still noticed her. Their friendship began casually. A borrowed ladder, a shared cup of coffee on a breezy afternoon, conversations that lingered longer each day. Jake would compliment her cooking, ask for advice about his future, and tease her in ways that felt harmless but stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Ellen tried to ignore it. She told herself it was nothing, just neighborly warmth. But late at night, when her phone buzzed and Jake's name appeared on the screen, she didn't hesitate to open it. The messages grew longer, more personal. He made her laugh again. He made her feel seen. It was dangerous, and Ellen knew it. Yet with each passing week, she found herself drawn closer, until one quiet evening, the line between friendship and something more blurred completely. No one in the neighborhood noticed the shift, the lingering glances, the subtle changes in Ellen's tone when she spoke to Jake, the sudden excitement that seemed to return to her voice. To everyone else, Ellen Parker was still the same woman she had always been. But she wasn't. Not anymore. By the end of that summer, everything about her life would change. And when she disappeared, the truth about what really happened would come not from a confession or a witness, but from a jealous young woman's phone. Jake Mendez wasn't the kind of man anyone would call dangerous. At 22, he was still more boy than man, restless, charming, with a streak of mischief that made people forgive his carelessness. He had dropped out of college the year before, unsure of what he wanted, drifting between temporary jobs and unfinished plans. When he returned home to his mother's new house on Maplewood Lane, he didn't expect to find much excitement. The neighborhood was quiet, made up mostly of families, retirees, and people living ordinary lives. But across the street lived Ellen Parker, elegant, gentle, and so unlike anyone Jake had ever met. At first, it was her kindness that caught his attention. She treated him like more than just the kid next door. She listened when he talked about his uncertainty, his frustrations, and his guilt over disappointing his father. She offered comfort in ways that felt maternal yet magnetic. And when she laughed, really laughed, Jake noticed the way her eyes softened, as if she hadn't allowed herself that moment of freedom in years. He began finding excuses to see her. Mowing her lawn when Daniel was away. Helping with repairs she didn't really need help with. Sometimes they'd sit outside for hours, talking about everything and nothing, while the evening sun melted behind the trees. The connection between them grew quietly, like a secret they both pretended not to notice. Until one evening, when the conversation lingered too long, and the silence between them became heavier than words. Jake remembered the moment clearly. Ellen standing at the kitchen counter, the faint scent of wine in the air, her hair loosely tied back. She looked tired, vulnerable, and beautiful in a way that felt forbidden. He stepped closer, said something about how Daniel was lucky to have her, and when she turned to respond, their eyes locked. The kiss wasn't planned. It just happened. Quick, breathless. Then silence. Ellen pulled away first, whispering that it was wrong, that it could never happen again. But the damage was already done. From that night on, the boundary between them no longer existed. Their affair unfolded in secret. Afternoon meetings while the neighborhood napped. Quiet drives on back roads. Cheap motels, 2 towns over where no one would recognize them. For Ellen, it was reckless and intoxicating. The kind of passion she thought belonged only to her youth. For Jake, it was possession. He wanted more of her, her attention, her time, her affection. But love built on secrecy never stays gentle for long. By September, Ellen started pulling back. Guilt had begun to swallow her whole. Her husband had grown suspicious of her new errands, and her daughter once asked why she smelled like a man's cologne after her so-called volunteer meetings. Ellen told Jake they needed to stop before anyone got hurt. Jake didn't take it well. He begged. Then he threatened to tell Daniel if she tried to end it. Ellen, frightened by how quickly his charm had turned to anger, promised she'd talk to him again, that they just needed space. But Jake wasn't listening anymore. And as Ellen began to retreat, another person entered the picture, one who would unknowingly set the final tragedy in motion. Her name was Maya Torres, Jake's on-and-off girlfriend, 20 years old, impulsive, and deeply in love with a man who no longer belonged entirely to her. She didn't know it yet, but soon Maya's text messages would reveal everything Ellen had fought so hard to keep hidden. Maya Torres had always known Jake was trouble. He had that kind of charm that could make a person forget every red flag waving in front of them. When she met him 2 years earlier at a party, he was wild and magnetic, the kind of man who made you feel like you were the only one in the room. Maya fell for him quickly, and even though he wasn't the most reliable boyfriend, she stayed. But by mid-2018, something about Jake had changed. He was distant, secretive, always on his phone. Sometimes he'd vanish for hours, claiming he was helping his mom with errands or working odd jobs. But Maya wasn't naive. She noticed the small eyes, the nervous tone, the way he'd smile when his phone buzzed, then turn it face down before she could see who it was. At first, she told herself it was another girl his age. She even snooped through his social media accounts, expecting to find flirty messages or old flames. But there was nothing. Jake had gotten better at hiding things. Still, something didn't sit right with her. One evening in July, she followed him. He told her he was meeting a friend about a landscaping job, but Maya, curious and hurt, drove behind him from a distance. She watched as he pulled into the parking lot of a small, low-budget motel outside town, the kind of place couples went when they didn't want to be seen. Her stomach dropped as she saw him step out of his car and wait. Minutes later, a silver SUV pulled in. She recognized it instantly. Ellen Parker's car. Maya froze in disbelief. The elegant woman she'd seen watering her plants, chatting politely with Jake's mom. That was the person he was meeting? She felt her hands tremble on the steering wheel, torn between confronting them and driving away. In the end, she left. But she didn't forget. Over the next few weeks, Maya started collecting everything. Screenshots of texts, phone call logs, cryptic social media posts. Jake began lying more often, disappearing for longer periods. And each time, Maya's anger grew. By August, she couldn't keep quiet anymore. One night, after Jake ignored her for 2 straight days, she confronted him. She shouted that she knew everything about Ellen, about the motel, about the secret messages. Jake tried to deny it at first, but when Maya showed him a picture she'd taken of Ellen's car parked beside his, he went pale. The argument turned explosive. Jake accused her of stalking him. Maya called him a liar. She threatened to tell Ellen's husband, to expose everything if Jake didn't come clean. In a panic, Jake grabbed her phone, deleted what he could, and stormed out of her apartment. But what he didn't realize was that Maya had already backed up the messages, every text, every photo, every timestamp. And it would be those messages, weeks later, that would reveal far more than anyone expected. Because just 2 weeks after that fight, Ellen Parker vanished. And Maya, the scorned girlfriend, would become both the first suspect and the key to unraveling the entire mystery. The morning Ellen Parker disappeared began like any other. A light drizzle fell over Maplewood Lane, dampening the driveways and muting the world in soft gray. Ellen's husband, Daniel, left early for a client meeting in Portland. Their teenage daughter was still asleep, her phone glowing beside her pillow, and their son had already caught the school bus. Ellen was alone in the house. Neighbors would later recall seeing her around 9 a.m., watering the front garden in a light blue sweater, her hair pulled back, her smile as gentle as ever. By mid-morning, her car was gone from the driveway. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Daniel returned home that evening, the house was quiet, too quiet. The lights were off. Dinner wasn't made, which was unusual for Ellen. At first, he assumed she was out with friends or running errands. But when hours passed and calls went unanswered, worry began to crawl in. By midnight, Daniel called the police. At first, officers treated it like a routine missing person report. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no indication that Ellen had left against her will. Her purse, phone, and car keys were gone, suggesting she'd left willingly. But the next morning, when her car was found abandoned 10 miles away near a wooded hiking trail, the case took a darker turn. The interior of the SUV was clean, too clean. Ellen's phone was missing, and her wallet sat untouched in the glove compartment. Investigators began retracing her movements that day, interviewing everyone, family, neighbors, and friends. That's when they knocked on the door across the street. Jake Mendez answered, looking nervous. He said he hadn't seen Ellen in days, claimed he barely knew her, beyond polite greetings. His story seemed rehearsed, but there was no concrete reason to doubt him. Not yet. Still, something in his demeanor raised quiet suspicion among the detectives. As days turned into weeks, the search for Ellen spread. Volunteers combed the woods, flyers covered telephone poles, and the community gathered for vigils. Daniel appeared on local TV, pleading for his wife's safe return. But behind the scenes, detectives were starting to suspect that Ellen's disappearance wasn't random at all. Her phone records told a story no one expected. There were hundreds of messages exchanged with a number registered to Jake Mendez. Calls late at night, voice notes, location sharing. When confronted again, Jake stumbled through excuses. She was just a friend. She needed someone to talk to. It wasn't what it looked like. But detectives had heard that tone before, fear mixed with guilt. Then came a tip that changed everything. A young woman named Maya Torres walked into the police station with her phone in hand. She told detectives she was Jake's girlfriend, and she had something they needed to see. Inside her phone were screenshots, text messages between Jake and Ellen spanning months, photos, audio notes, and one thread that made every investigator in the room go silent. It was a message from Jake to Maya, sent 2 days before Ellen vanished. You'll get what you want soon. She said she's ending it, but she's not walking away that easy. Maya told detectives she hadn't understood what he meant at the time. She thought he was just angry. But now, after Ellen's disappearance, it sounded like something far worse. For the first time, Jake wasn't just a person of interest. He was the center of the storm. By the 3rd week of Ellen Parker's disappearance, Maplewood Lane no longer felt like the quiet, peaceful street it once was. News vans lined the curb, Reporters hovered near driveways, and whispers spread faster than facts. Everyone had a theory. Some believed Ellen had run away. Others thought her husband knew more than he was admitting. But detectives were now focused on one man, Jake Mendez. The text messages from Maya Torres had blown the case wide open. They painted a picture of a relationship that was far from casual, one filled with jealousy, secrecy, and threats. Detectives called Jake back in for questioning. He arrived wearing a faded hoodie, his hands trembling slightly. At first, he tried to play it calm, insisting Ellen had been a friend who got the wrong idea. But as investigators presented the messages, his own words staring back at him from a phone screen, the confidence drained from his face. "You said here she wasn't going to walk away that easy," one detective pressed. "What did you mean by that?" Jake hesitated, eyes darting toward the floor. He mumbled something about emotional frustration, claiming it was just talk, anger, nothing more. But the room was thick with tension. Detectives had heard it all before. Then came another breakthrough. Forensic teams traced Ellen's last phone signal to a remote area just 2 miles from where her SUV had been found, a secluded trail surrounded by thick pine trees and uneven terrain. When officers returned to the area, they found something odd: tire tracks that didn't match Ellen's vehicle and faint impressions of a struggle near a patch of disturbed soil. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to keep Jake under close watch. Meanwhile, Maya became both a witness and a reluctant accomplice in the investigation. She sat through hours of interviews, replaying voice notes and showing messages she had once ignored. Each one revealed how obsessive Jake had become, his possessiveness over Ellen, his growing resentment, and the way he spoke about her belonging to him. Maya listened to her own voice on those recordings, trembling as she realized how far things had gone without her seeing it. But one detail stood out, something she remembered the night of Ellen's disappearance. Jake had shown up at her apartment late, looking disheveled and pale. His shirt was stained, and he claimed his car had gotten stuck in mud near the woods. Maya asked what happened, and he told her he'd been clearing his head. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now that night played in her mind like a scene she couldn't escape. Detectives took her statement seriously. They brought in cadaver dogs and began a more focused search of the wooded area Jake had mentioned. Days turned into nights as teams combed through the dense forest, guided by flashlights and the faint hope of finding something. Anything. Then, on the 11th day of the expanded search, they found what they were looking for. Buried under a shallow layer of dirt near the base of a large pine tree were fragments of fabric and traces of human remains. The site was sealed off within minutes. Though DNA results would take time, Ellen's wedding ring was recovered from the soil, a simple gold band engraved with her initials and Daniel's. It was enough to confirm everyone's worst fear. The story hit the news that night, and within hours, the once quiet neighborhood was consumed by shock and grief. Daniel Parker collapsed when police informed him. Reporters swarmed the area. And across the street, behind drawn curtains, Jake Mendez sat in silence, watching as officers marked the area he thought no one would ever find. When police arrived at his door later that evening, he didn't resist. He simply whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." But what exactly had happened? What pushed a lonely housewife and a restless young man into a deadly spiral? The answer lay hidden in the final string of text messages between Jake, Ellen, and the jealous girlfriend who unknowingly became the voice of truth. The final pieces of the puzzle didn't come from fingerprints or DNA. They came from words, desperate, emotional, and irreversible, trapped in the glow of a phone screen. When detectives examined Maya's backup files, they uncovered a long chain of messages exchanged between her and Jake in the 48 hours before Ellen's disappearance. Each message revealed a little more of the tension building between them, and the truth that Ellen's death wasn't a sudden act, but a collision of obsession, guilt, and rage. The first messages were mundane, Jake venting about Ellen wanting to end things, saying she'd grown scared. But as the thread continued, the tone darkened. "Jake, she thinks she can just walk away. Like I didn't mean anything." "Maya, so let her go, Jake. She's married." "Jake, you don't understand. She promised me." She said she'd leave him. Hours later, another message appeared. Jake, she's coming over tomorrow. I'll make her listen. Maya told detectives she had tried to ignore it. She thought he just meant an argument, a confrontation. But the next day, when Ellen never returned home, those words took on a far darker meaning. The second thread of messages, recovered from Jake's phone itself, was between him and Ellen. It showed the emotional spiral that led to her final hours. Ellen, this has to stop, Jake. It's gone too far. Jake, you can't just erase me. Ellen, I'm begging you. I have a family. I can't keep doing this. Jake, you said you loved me. Ellen, I cared about you, but this isn't love. Please don't come over. The messages stopped there. No replies. No calls. But location data showed that Jake drove to Ellen's house that same evening. Her phone went dark shortly after. Investigators pieced together what they believed happened next. Ellen met him outside, trying to end things once and for all. Jake, fueled by anger and heartbreak, refused to accept it. Their argument escalated, turned physical, and somewhere between pleading and panic, things went too far. When confronted with the messages, Jake finally broke. He confessed in fragments, unable to look anyone in the eye. He told detectives that Ellen had tried to leave, that she pushed him away and told him never to speak to her again. He claimed he grabbed her arm. She struggled, slipped, hit her head on a rock by the car. He said he didn't mean for her to die. But instead of calling for help, fear took over. He panicked, loaded her into her car, and drove to the wooded area where he buried her. It was cowardice disguised as love, and it destroyed 3 lives at once. Jake's confession matched the evidence. The soil on his tires, the fibers found on Ellen's sweater, the timeline of his movements. But perhaps the most haunting proof came from Maya's final set of messages, the one she sent him hours after the murder, not knowing what had happened. Maya, you said she'd be gone. What did you do? Jake, don't ask questions you don't want answers to. She showed those texts to detectives, her hands trembling. She hadn't understood them at the time, but now they were enough to seal Jake's fate. When he was arrested, he didn't fight it. He simply asked one question. Will she forgive me wherever she is? No one answered. The trial of Jake Mendez began 6 months after Ellen Parker's body was found. By then, the small town of Maplewood had become a symbol of tragedy, a place where whispers of suburban perfection had given way to the reality of human frailty. The courtroom was packed from the first day. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras waiting for emotion. A tear, a confession, a sign of remorse. On one side sat Daniel Parker and his children, their faces hollow from months of grief. On the other sat Jake, head bowed, his once carefree demeanor replaced by the weight of what he had done. Prosecutors described the affair as a slow-burning obsession. They presented the text messages as the foundation of the case, the digital footprints of desire, control, and fear. One by one, the messages were read aloud, their words echoing in the courtroom like ghosts of the past. When Ellen's final plea, "Please don't come over," was projected on the screen, Daniel stood up and left the room. He couldn't listen any longer. Maya Torres testified next. Her voice shook as she recounted the nights Jake came home angry, the threats he made, and the moment she realized Ellen was gone. She broke down when the prosecution asked about the text Jake had sent her afterward. "I thought he just meant she was leaving town," Maya said through tears. "I didn't think he meant gone." Her testimony became the emotional turning point of the trial. The defense tried to argue that the incident was an accident, a moment of passion turned tragic. They painted Jake as a young man overwhelmed by emotions, someone who lost control. But the jury saw through it. The premeditated tone in his messages, his decision to hide Ellen's body, and the cold detachment afterward were impossible to ignore. After 3 weeks, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty of second-degree murder. Jake showed little reaction. He stared straight ahead as the sentence was read. 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Behind him, Maya wept quietly, while Daniel sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for statements, but Daniel refused to speak. The only words he offered came months later, in a short letter read during Ellen's memorial service. Ellen was a woman who believed in kindness, in seeing the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That kindness was her strength, and in the end, it was also what made her vulnerable. We will not remember how she died, but how she lived, as a mother, a wife, and a light that even tragedy cannot erase. The story faded from the headlines soon after. Maplewood Lane went quiet again, but it would never feel the same. The house across from the Parkers remained empty for months, its windows dark, the garden overgrown. Maya eventually moved away, leaving behind a place that had witnessed too much pain. She turned her phone off for good, saying she couldn't stand the sound of a message notification anymore. And Daniel Parker, though still living in the same house, rarely spoke of that summer. Some nights, neighbors said they saw him sitting on the porch, staring across the street, at the empty house where a young man's infatuation had turned into a nightmare. The texts that once bound Ellen and Jake together were now sealed in police archives, evidence of how quickly desire can twist into destruction. In the end, it wasn't violence or malice that killed Ellen Parker. It was love, distorted into something unrecognizable. Time moved on, but the echoes of what happened on Maplewood Lane never truly faded. Years later, people still spoke of Ellen Parker's disappearance as if it were a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in quiet tones at neighborhood gatherings. The house she once filled with warmth and laughter now stood as a hollow shell, a reminder that even the most perfect lives can crumble from within. Daniel Parker eventually sold the house and moved to another town. He never remarried. Friends said he devoted his time to his children and to advocacy work for domestic abuse and emotional manipulation victims, determined that Ellen's story would serve a purpose beyond the pain. He spoke rarely about her death, but when he did, he always said the same thing: no one deserves to vanish because of love. Jake Mendez remained in prison. Over the years, he sent letters to Ellen's family, apologies they never opened. The boy who once smiled over hedges had become a ghost behind bars, haunted by the moment he couldn't undo. He told prison counselors he still dreamed of her, standing in the garden, sunlight on her face, just as she was the first day he met her. And Maya, she tried to rebuild her life. The guilt never left her, the feeling that she might have stopped everything if she had spoken sooner. But she found a strange kind of healing in helping others recognize the signs she once ignored. She volunteered at women's shelters, telling them, obsession isn't love. Silence isn't peace. For those who remember Ellen Parker, her story became more than a tragedy. It became a reflection of how fragile trust can be, how quickly comfort can turn to danger when boundaries blur. Love, when twisted by loneliness and fear, becomes something else entirely, something unrecognizable. Ellen's story isn't just about betrayal or jealousy. It's about the quiet lives that unravel when secrets grow too heavy to hide. And perhaps most haunting of all, it reminds us that the truth always finds a voice, sometimes through tears, sometimes through confessions, and sometimes through the glow of a single message on a phone that was never meant to be read. Thank you for watching. If Ellen's story moved you, or if it reminded you how fragile love and trust can be, take a moment to share this video. Because stories like hers remind us that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories where the truth hides in plain sight. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, every story has a heartbeat.